Hey everyone, really excited to have you guys back for the Where Do We Go From Here series. It's Imran Khan again. I'm really excited that you've stuck with me, stuck with the conversation. I'm also really thrilled today to have one of my best friends from business school joining me, Elfrun von Koeller, to talk a little bit about global supply chain. Elfrun is a partner and managing director at Boston Consulting Group. She works on their consumer packaged goods as well as corporate finance practice, has worked with tons and tons of different types of consumer packaged goods, from like vitamins to like chewing gum to you name it. She'll tell you a little bit more about herself in just a second. But I'm really excited because Elfrun's also probably the smartest person I know, like actually the smartest person I know. So really thrilled to have you here, Elfrun. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we jump into the questions, I know I tried to introduce you, but do you want to give a little bit more clarification around your specific role and the types of projects that you're doing at Boston Consulting Group?
Yes, absolutely. So I've been at BCG for the last 13 years and have spent most of my time there focusing on CPG clients and specifically do a bunch of work on supply chain networks and how they should be structured and how to manage getting products out the door. And I now lead the operations topic actually for our consumer practice in North America. So
very cool.
Happy to speak a little bit about that.
And yeah, thank you so much for giving your time. I really appreciate it. So we can jump right in. I am basically asking the same three questions to all the folks that I've been interviewing. And the first one is, what's been the impact of the current crisis on supply chain and global supply chain? What are you seeing that's happening that's really noteworthy?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing obviously is people working in supply chain are often classified as essential workers, right? So you are working with a population that can't work remote because you can't load a truck remote, you can't, ship boxes remote. It just, that doesn't work. So the really first priority is honestly safety of your people in, any organization you work in. And it's a little different on whether you can stop production or not, right? At the height of this crisis, 96% of automotive manufacturing was shut down because no one's buying cars. So you can just, basically go on a production holiday and say nobody's coming into work. Whereas if you work in food production, that's not the case. You need to keep food production going. You need to make sure supermarket shelves keep getting stocked. And same thing, obviously, if you work in Amazon or somewhere like that, where e-commerce shipping volume has really gone up dramatically.
Yeah, that's really crazy. I mean, that's something that, I'm here in Germany, like that was one of the things that I found most interesting, to see the types of shortages that started to happen for different types of products. And, everyone is talking a little bit about the toilet paper hoarding and shortages that started.
Yes.
But it was very interesting. And I think, thinking specifically about that, like about how, who's considered an essential workforce, a part of the essential workforce. Did you see any other noteworthy, like either disruptions or examples of ramping up that were just really spectacular,
yeah,
that you thought were worth talking about, perhaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So, beyond keeping your workers safe, which is priority number one, there is that crazy surge in demand for many products on the CPG side. So if you think about any cleaning products, hand soap, toilet paper, specific food products, vitamins, anything to do with immunity, honestly, demand has doubled or tripled, and no one has that kind of capacity, right? Just sitting in their networks. So, what people have had to do is make decisions. Some have added shifts, production days. Some have really dramatically reduced their portfolio. So, if you typically make 40 different products of cleaning wipes, you lose production time every time you switch between one product and the next. So many companies have said, we're just not going to do that. We're basically making the one product that runs the fastest, and that's going to come off our line, and everything else is not getting shipped right now. And then the third big implication beyond, worker safety and production increases is actually your planning systems are breaking down, because most planning systems are based on historical volumes, and then you overlay, promotions and things like that to get to the right forecast. And honestly, historical volumes are irrelevant at this point. Like what sold last year has absolutely no bearing on what's going to sell this year. And, consumers make all these shifts because honestly, their favorite product might not even be on the shelf, or they might be in a different location, living with their parents instead of being in a big city. Right. And demand is totally different than it's ever been. So your forecasting models are useless. Like you can shut them off. And instead, you need to kind of think about, what's the progression of the epidemic? How safe do people feel leaving the house? What is available in the shelf? So where's demand going to move if the preferred product isn't there? So there's a really big implication for your planning system and your inventory allocation as well.
We've already experienced that personally. So we try really hard to buy eco-friendly products, particularly toilet paper, going back to it, like recyclable toilet paper or recyclable, paper towels, and they're just not available. It's just like not available whatsoever. It's really, really crazy. So I actually think this is really great because it leans right into my second question, which is around, well, why is this impact so important, right? What are going to be some of the short-term and long-term consequences of what we're seeing as a part of the current crisis, as it pertains to global supply chain? And how do you think people are going to start to do things a little bit differently?
Yeah. I mean, I think the short-term impact is really honestly just, keeping things running. It's, making sure a lot of things companies have done is, for example, establish completely different, sanitation and hygiene practices, do more deep cleanings, allow social distancing within your facilities by having people further apart, by staggering lunch breaks, by staggering when shift starts, so not everybody's coming in at the same time. There's things like doing temperature checks, so you make sure, people don't have a fever coming in. So there's some, shorter term implications, and I've already spoken about some of the portfolio switches people have done and really reduced their portfolio. And on the planning point specifically, some people have centralized planning more and built it more around macroeconomic forecasting and epidemiological forecasting versus historicals. So those are the types of things that are kind of immediate. There's also elements around raw materials. Some industries have incurred raw material shortages, and for example, in the US, cans to put beverages in are running out. So, all the big soda companies have to figure out, beer and soda companies have to figure out, what do you put the product in? Which products do you still want to, fill, and which ones maybe you only do the plastic bottles, things like that. So there's also a component around, supply and raw material shortages, and really planning through, how much of what do you still have, where can you find a second supplier, and doing all that. So those are some of the shorter term actions. In the medium to long term, I do think this will have quite profound impacts. So one is around digitalization. I think the supply chains I've seen that had more information and more data fared much better than the ones that didn't. So I do think this will accelerate, just the shift towards having better visibility of what's going on, from raw materials and what's coming in to where your inventory is, to what your demand really is and how to allocate that inventory. So I think there's going to be a further push in that direction. I also think there's going to be a push towards more resiliency. And I know CPG best. Obviously, there's other, focuses in other sectors, but in CPG, the focus has been on cost and efficiency for quite a while now. And people have, shut down excess capacity and really, taking out inventory, and all of that's great unless you have a disruption. And then, you get empty supermarket shelves. And so I do think there will be a little bit more of a rethink of, where do we need some extra buffers? Where do we maybe, carry a little extra inventory of, specific raw materials? Where do we maybe add second suppliers and maybe give a little on cost, but increase the resiliency of your system? So, shock doesn't knock you out right away. So I think those are two elements. And then the third one I do think is around a network rethink. That's going to be a little less in food and beverage, which is more localized, but in all the global supply chains, I do think there's going to be a little bit of a consideration of, do you really want to have all your raw materials come from the same town in China, or do you want to be more diversified?
And I think you gave me this, when we were prepping for this conversation, you gave me this example of medical supplies, right? Like, do you want to talk a little bit more about that, like specifically around how there'll be a need perhaps to localize production for some of those things, given if another pandemic hit or?
Yeah. So I mean, we don't know what the regulatory environment is going to be across countries. In the US, there's always been some regulation on the pharma side on, you can't single source your most important ingredients and things like that. Mm-hmm. We anticipate that there will be more. We don't know exactly what yet. That's still being worked out, but there could quite easily be regulations around medical supplies having to have some local production or needing, minimum amounts of inventory in the country, things like that. And we don't quite know what's going to come yet, but we do anticipate that there's going to be increased focus on those types of elements from regulators. And honestly, maybe even in food, who knows, right? There might even be increased focus on that again and food security.
Because I remember when we were talking about it, just like the idea that an entire country could run out of cotton swabs, right? To run like tests for a particular illness or whatnot. Like, that's just so mind-boggling to think that we're so streamlined. Yeah, that we don't really have a backup option for that. So that's really interesting. So the third question, moving right along into it, now that we've gotten these really interesting understanding of why this is so important is, well, where do we go from here, right? The question is really about asking some advice as to what you think are some of the things that we can do to really anticipate some of these challenges of tomorrow, the medium, long-term challenges. And I'm curious if you could maybe give us the perspective, not only from the side of companies and supply chain, but what would you do as a consumer? I'm curious just to get your thought as a consumer, what you would be doing to tell, you're also a parent, have a family. I'm curious to get that perspective as well.
Yeah. I mean, as a consumer in this current environment, I think some understanding of how hard it is to get stuff on the shelf is good. Everybody complains about the toilet paper not being there, but people are trying their hardest. Right. Long term, I would say keep the standards high on sustainability and what you expect from the product you buy. You were mentioning, the recycled, or more environmentally friendly products might not be on the shelf right now. I do think this current moment where the epidemic is obviously on everybody's mind and it's the biggest crisis, should not let us forget that there's still also, the environmental crisis and climate change. And so I think, as things get hopefully a little bit better, back to normal, making sure that you still keep the standards high on those things and keep pushing the food and beverage and home care companies on their standards in their supply chain, I think is good as a consumer to do. And also, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think this is an opportunity to make some positive changes as well, and just look at, for example, working conditions. Meat plants have gotten a lot of heat for being outbreaks of infection, but by the way, there are outbreaks of infection also because the working conditions are really poor. So is this an opportunity to relook at some of those things and say, okay, let's change it now because there's an immediate need, but also let's then, keep the standards high for the future.
Yeah, and then, I mean, that's just such invaluable advice, I think, to really, keep the long-term thinking at play, because it is so easy to just fall into this short-term thinking, particularly like what's in front of me, what can I buy, what can I grab? Mm-hmm. And then on the supply chain side, I know you talked a little bit about, the digitalization fared well, the supply chains that had more data and more information. I'm curious, do you have advice on that side for businesses? Like, what are some of the things that they could be doing to be more resilient, to be more, future focused if something like this were to happen again?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, so yes, I believe in investing in, more data and more information and more analytics. I think that's now is a good time to do that, especially if you're in one of the companies that has, tripled or quadrupled demand, and you have some extra cash. Like now is a good time to invest in some of those business analytics. I do think looking at the network again and just thinking through how resilient is it, how future-proof is it if we think about things that might happen with global trade flows or with, further epidemics, I think is a really good thing to do. And a sub point under that is also just looking at your current disaster recovery plans.
Mm-hmm.
I know in the US, for example, a lot of companies had disaster recovery plans around hurricanes, and it was very focused on like, what do we happen if this one site gets flooded or has a hurricane or whatever, and no one ever thought about like a national, event. And so, just looking at those plans again and saying, okay, would this hold up in different scenarios, and maybe making those scenarios a little more extreme, I think is a good idea. And then also, looking at the product portfolio, because a lot of CPG companies have cut down their portfolio by like 50% and more during this crisis. And the question is, did you really need all those products? Or like, do you want to bring all of them back is, I think, a good question to ask. Like, you don't, just because it used to be sold at some point doesn't mean it has to be, right? If there's a better option now, I think, relooking at the product portfolio is also a really good thing to do.
I think to me, that's like such an incredibly fascinating thing to think about, that, right, there's certain products that are either more easily made or have a higher demand at this moment and make much more business sense to really hone in and focus on those products from an operations perspective to get them off the line and into the market. I think that's a really good question to just for all companies to really be asking themselves, right? Do we really need to be adding to the, let's say, noise or waste or whatever you want to term it, but really, really interesting. I can't thank you enough. This has been so fascinating to think through a little bit about, both from a consumer perspective and from a company perspective, some of the things that are happening and how the world has really changed, right? it's we were just chatting right before the starting the recording this little chat. It's just like a really, really big shift in terms of our, new normal, so to speak. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. And who knows, maybe in a year or so, I might get you back on the line to talk a little bit about what happened. Some of those predictions came true or not.
Sounds great. Have a great day.
Bye. Ciao.